Hi, everyone. This has been an issue that keeps coming up from time to time of what is the date of the book of Revelations. I believe it's in the 60s because it's written before the temple has fallen, according to the contextual statements inside the book of Revelation. It also fits the timeline of John's life at Patmos. It also fits the fact that the Gospel of John was written in the 90s, just before he died, and Papias was right there, his amanuensis, the bishop of Hierapolis. He verified that's what happened. He died that year. So we really do know who wrote this, and it's probably the best attested all the writings of the New Testament. We know who wrote it. We know it's an apostle, and we know when he wrote it. And we know that he lived much longer after that fact and spread its success in the Asia Minor, where Patmos was next to. So there's so many overwhelming pieces of evidence about the validity of this, but because of certain things about Paul that it implicates, it's generally not liked. So people try to find every which way to change it up and not have to pay attention to it. But there is a curse over this, that anyone who removes a word from this work and basically throws it off to different dispensation, whatever you want to do with it, and just toss it out, that you're risking everything. You'll be written out of the book of life. So I just want to put this down so that anybody who's at the precipice of losing their salvation would not take that step. And we would then regard this as one of the best attested works of the New Testament. Okay, let's begin. I have an article I did years ago, and I'm going to just kind of read it straight and see. Hope that will be clear. Okay, so my article is called "The Authenticity of the Book of Revelation." Introduction. Many conservative scholars note a stark departure in the book of Revelation from Paul's teachings. J.B. Lightfoot notes the emphasis is on the ongoing validity of the message in the Hebrew scriptures. The whole book of Revelation is saturated with illustrations from the Old Testament. It speaks not the language of Paul, but of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. J.B. Lightfoot, The Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians, Grand Rapids, Zondervan, 1970 at 361. You can already see there's a reason why people might not like this work. Other scholars, such as Bauer, argue that Revelation was intentionally anti-Paul. And Bauer wrote in the 1830s and up to the 1850s. He cited its emphasis on physical Israel's place in God's eternal plan, the validity of the law, the Mosaic law, and the mention of Jesus returning to Mount Zion, where the law was given, and salvation doctrines apparently at odds with Paul. Bauer asserted these elements were designed to send a clearly anti-Pauline message. Yes, that's where the first scholarship arose in the modern era of looking at the writings of Paul in a very negative light. Indeed, in Revelation we can find direct conflict with Paul's teachings. However, there is no point in examining the challenge Revelation poses to Paul unless we're thoroughly convinced Revelation is properly in canon. Of course, since Jesus is speaking in Revelation, it derives from a true, valid prophet. The question of its authenticity then falls upon whether Apostle John actually wrote it. Canonicity of the Book of Revelation. The book of Revelation purports to be written by the Apostle John. Revelation says it was written while he, John, was exiled in Patmos. Revelation 1, verse 9. The island of Patmos was just offshore of Ephesus, a large town in proconsular Asia. That means it's called Asia, but it's not in China. It means it's in the area called Asia within the Roman Empire, and that's why it's called proconsular Asia. Present-day Western Turkey. After John's release from Patmos, John moved to Ephesus. There he later wrote the Gospel of John. And we have a little footnote on that. We'll get to that in a second. Thus, Revelation was written first at Patmos, Revelation 1:9. The Gospel of John came later when John moved to Ephesus. And here's the footnote. The Catholic Encyclopedia, entry on St. John the Evangelist states, quote, Justin Martyr refers to John, one of the apostles of Christ, as a witness who had lived with us, that is, at Ephesus. So that tells you that Justin Martyr apparently had personal knowledge that John lived at Ephesus. Irenaeus speaks in very many places of the Apostle John and his residence in Asia. Again, that's proconsular Asia. That is Western Turkey. The other side of the sea from the Aegean Sea is, if you go east to the left, it would be Greece. So if you cross the Aegean onto that landmass, that's modern-day Turkey. That's on that left portion, that western portion, if you will, of that landmass. That's called Asia of the government of Rome, and expressly declares he wrote his gospel at Ephesus, and that's at Versus Horaces 3, 1.1.1, and that he lived there until the reign of Trajan. Okay, so we have good information about this. And again, that's important because, again, what are we able to prove? We're going to be able to prove that this is the best attested writing of the entire New Testament. When John dies, the last thing he writes is his gospel, and he dies soon thereafter. So if anybody wanted to make a fraud of that, John's not around to tell anybody. But the book of Revelation, he's living 30 years after it's been written. And therefore, if anyone's trying to change it, he would have been a person who could have said or done something about it. Let's watch what happens and how it's accepted. Prompt acceptance in region near Ephesus. As we would expect if John truly wrote Revelation, the bishops of the Roman territories nearby to Patmos and Ephesus were the first to accept it as John's writing. The nearby Christian bishops who accepted as John's writings were Justin Martyr of Rome. He was living and active in 135 AD. Irenaeus, bishop in Gaul, which is modern France, 120 to 200 AD. Theophilus, bishop of Antioch in Syria, he was active around 177 AD. Tertullian, a famous church leader at Carthage of North Africa, he was active in the period 155 to 200 AD. And Clement of Alexandria, Egypt, 180 through 200 AD. Likewise, it was accepted around 175 AD by Melito, a bishop over one of the 7 churches addressed, Sardis. Melito even wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, right? So he dies in 175. So he's literally, he knows people who lived in the generation when John was still alive, probably 75 years after John dies. Melito is writing this. There's people who could have been born at that time and are alive at the time of Melito writing. Let's look at the footnotes here. That mention of Melito is in Eusebius, The History of the Church, Book 4, Chapter 26. And footnote 2, let's take a look at what that was about. That was Clement of Alexandria, and actually several of these names here all came out of this work. Isban Beckwith, The Apocalypse of John, Eugene Oregon, Wipf and Stock Publishers, 2001, at 338 and 339. Let's continue. This trail of church leaders accepting Apostle John as the author is strong evidence of the authenticity of Revelation. As a highly respected Bible commentator, A.R. Fawcett reasoned, if the Apocalypse were not inspired work of John, purporting as it does to be an address from their superior to the 7 churches of proconsular Asia, it would have assuredly been rejected in that region, whereas the earliest testimonies in those churches are all in its favor. And that's footnote 4. That's in A.R. Fawcett, The Revelation of St. John the Divine, and Robert Jamieson and Fawcett and Brown, a commentary critical and explanatory on the Old and New Testaments. Logos Research, 1997, reprinted in 1877 edition on the topic Revelation 1, verse 1. Let's continue. Bishop Papias vouches identity of author of Revelation. More important, the earliest Christian leader who attested to the validity of Revelation was Papias. He was bishop of Hierapolis in nearby Syria, which borders the eastern edge of Turkey. He wrote about 100 AD. This is important because of Papias' close association with Apostle John. Papias' own writings mention frequent personal contacts with Apostle John. I'm just going to interrupt there. He was the amanuensis. He was the person who John dictated his gospel to. That's the record Papias made. This is likewise corroborated by Eusebius in a quotation from a book entitled Exposition of the Oracles of the Lord. This excerpt appears in Eusebius' famous work, Ecclesiastical History, at 339. In section 9, exposition mentions, quote, Papias of Hierapolis the illustrious, a disciple of the apostle who leaned on the bosom of Christ, period. Clearly, exposition is saying Papias is the disciple of Apostle John. In section 8 of exposition, we read further about Papias' view about the book of Revelation. With regard to the inspiration of the book, Revelation, we deem it superfluous to add another word, for the blessed Gregory Theophilus and Cyril, and even men of still older date, Papias, Irenaeus, Methodius, and Hippolytus of Rome, bore entirely satisfactory testimony of it. So that's in this section 8 of exposition, and that's from Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History. Irenaeus likewise corroborates Papias' new Apostle John. Irenaeus writes that Papias was, quote, a hearer of Apostle John who wrote a volume in, quote, 5 books. Irenaeus Against Heresies, 5.33.4, quoted by Eusebius. Thus, to discount Revelation, you have to believe that a pupil of Apostle John and a bishop of Syria, Papias, wrongly ascribed it to his teacher. That theory just doesn't make any sense. More importantly, again, I'm going to show you, I have another video on Papias as being the amanuensis. This was recorded in a Bible in the 7th century, and that was a quote of an earlier work where Papias is writing, and he says he was the amanuensis, the scribe who was taking dictation from John to do the Gospel of John in about 95, 96 AD. Let's continue. Politics and religion don't mix. Eusebius' attack on Papias. Okay. So, Book of Revelation, what do you know about Eusebius? He is uh, I don't want to be derogatory. He loves Constantine. He's wants the Roman Empire to be regarded as the savior of Christianity. It's going to take away all the persecution. We put all our loyalty on King Constantine, the new emperor. And if we do that, everything's going to work out great. We're all put on salaries. This is just a wonderful, it's like a boon. It's like how it's too good to be true. And that's what ends up happening. And he's the cheerleader of this. That's what Eusebius does. Why is that a problem? Because inside the book of Revelation, it says that the Antichrist, or one of the Antichrist type figures, is going to be coming out of the seven hills. And Rome is known as the city of seven hills. So Rome does not like the book of Revelation. It depicts something about that city in a very negative light in the book of Revelation. So just bear that in mind as I read to you this next part. Eusebius, in about 325 AD, wrote in his ecclesiastical history a very harsh attack on Papias. His purpose was to undermine the canonicity of Revelation. Okay, so why would he do that? Because that serves his new emperor, the Constantine. Eusebius made it appear his attack was subjective, never explaining what political or theological problems might be motivating his attack. Most commentators believe that Eusebius was doing this for political reasons. Eusebius had baptized Emperor Constantine and was Constantine's favorite bishop. Thus, Eusebius could be influenced by the political aims of Constantine. How could Constantine's interests be harmed if Revelation were treated as inspired? Previously, the church had uniformly believed in how Revelation literally reads, "We are at a premillennial point, waiting for Jesus to return and usher in the millennium." The prophecy of the beast and great horror in Revelation chapter 17, who were to arise from the city on seven hills, Rome. The early church never understood Revelation as having been fulfilled in Nero, as Gundry teaches today. So it wasn't somebody who was already dead at the time that John is speaking. This is somebody in the future, in other words, is what is being mentioned there. As a result, in Eusebius' day, it was still an open issue whether some Roman leader yet to come was going to be the beast. In Revelation, the mother of harlots, Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, is described as the, quote, great city, Revelation 17, verse 18, and this woman sits on, quote, seven hills, Revelation 17, verse 9. Rome is the proverbial city on seven hills. Constantine could worry that is how his Christian subjects would view the prophecy. Rome also fit because it says the city is, quote, drunk on the blood of the saints, Revelation 17, verse 6. Of course, Rome had persecuted Christians. Revelation could then be viewed as a warning of a future Roman emperor as the beast. It says this mother of harlots, which represents the city on seven hills, was, quote, carried by the beast, Revelation 17, verse 7. Therefore, this city, or mother of harlots, sits atop the beast. Who is the beast? He is described as an earthly ruler. The beast is identified as an eighth king in Revelation 17, verse 11. It doesn't take a genius to realize Constantine did not want anyone looking in his direction to identify the beast. Revelation was a potentially seditious writing. Constantine had a second reason to fight off Revelation. The book of Revelation depicts the Jews of the pre-Christian era as still the key covenant partner with God. There's no replacement theology in the book of Revelation. Furthermore, Revelation focuses attention on Jerusalem as the future center of world power, not Rome. A Roman emperor certainly would prefer associating his local Roman church as the new Israel. He would favor spiritualizing away Jerusalem as the center of God's plans. Instead, he wanted to move the focus of Christianity to Rome. In fact, a theology developed under Constantine that Peter moved the church headquarters to Rome. This was a myth. Thus, under Constantine, the official doctrine of the Roman bishop, who began calling himself Pope, was that he had supremacy over the entire church. He also claimed Peter moved the headquarters of Christianity to Rome, hence was born the Roman Catholic Church in the 300s. All these pro-Roman doctrinal changes in Constantine's church would be undermined by the message in Revelation. This explains Eusebius' attack on the book of Revelation. And let's just see what footnote 6 says. The key reason for the rejection of the book among some of the early church was because they viewed any fulfillment of Old Testament promises involving the Jews with great disdain. Okay, so what's going on here? You have dispensationalism is already taking place. Is we don't want to see any good things happening to Israel, and we want to see only good things happening to bad things happening to Israel, and only good things happening to Gentiles. Okay, so we don't want a Gentile king or ruler, Constantine, to be feeling uncomfortable. Let's put it that way. All right, let's go back here. Whatever Eusebius' underlying reason, he tried to undermine belief John wrote Revelation. Eusebius knew Papias was strong proof that Revelation was written by Apostle John, so Eusebius cast aspersions on Papias as a, quote, a man of exceedingly small intelligence. History Ecclesiastical 3.39.13. Eusebius had no proof of this. I mean, it's 200 years earlier. Does he know the guy? Is his writing so dumb? Then show us. But that's not what's going on here, ladies and gentlemen. There's politics. There's theologically driven history. And nothing more theologically driven in history has ever been written than the ecclesiastical history by Eusebius. What can we say? Eusebius engaged in pure slander. He does not demonstrate it from anything foolish that Papias might have said. Eusebius goes on and next casts doubt that Papias knew Apostle John that well. Really? He notes Papias' writings, quoted from a book called The Expositions, mentions more often that he's talking to a disciple of the Lord, whom Papias calls John the Presbyter. So what? While some argue that Papias is referring to Apostle John by this title of John the Presbyter, maybe not. The actual quote Eusebius provides from Exposition does appear to identify a second John distinct from Apostle John. Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History 3.39.3 to 7. So, big deal. There's another person who's known as John the Presbyter. Just because that person exists doesn't cast doubt when he was talking about Apostle John that he meant somebody else. But this is how desperate people are to find a way that this book was not written by John. And I showed you why right at the beginning. Anything that's anti-Paul or can be perceived as anti-Paul has to be done away with. And even if it's your salvation will go out the window according to the last passage of the book. Okay, but it doesn't matter. Paul wins no matter what. That's the bottom line. Okay. However, all Eusebius proved from the quote is that Papias knew both Apostle John and John the Elder. Eusebius could not win his case of impugning the authenticity of the book of Revelation unless he proved Papias actually did not know Apostle John. Since Eusebius in that same context proved and elsewhere admitted that Papias was the pupil of Apostle John, his argument goes nowhere. Papias' friendship with Apostle John is something also attested to by Jerome and by Irenaeus. Accordingly, we must reject Eusebius' effort to make it appear Papias' acquaintance with Apostle John was so minimal that it had no bearing on the authenticity of the book of Revelation. There is no such thing as knowing a person too slightly that is the same as not knowing them at all. Thus, Eusebius could never and did never discount completely that Papias knew directly from Apostle John whether he was the hand that wrote Revelation. Now, just to be clear here, again, the Christian church kept, and it was part of the preface to one of the Bibles, we'll see later, it was the Toledo Bible, I believe, we'll go into that later, that said, just matter of factly, that Papias had been the amanuensis, the person to whom John dictated the book of John. But that's in 90s, 30 years after the book of Revelation. So if Papias says that John wrote the book of Revelations, it's because he's personally acquainted with John, the apostle, while he's the person receiving the dictation for the Gospel of John. I mean, how closer can you be to somebody for hours and days, whatever? Do you think he might have mentioned, hey, John, love your book of Revelation? So, of course. So he knows John wrote that book. So it's just impossible that he didn't have enough acquaintance with John to know that John wrote the book of Revelation. So when Papias says so, that John wrote the book of Revelation, that's guaranteed fact that that's what happened. Eusebius made the most valiant effort to disprove Revelation was written by John, yet in doing so, he actually helped preserve the proof to the contrary. Regardless, you have the book of Revelation accepted by so many bishops and early leaders in the surrounding territories that it defies all likelihood that Apostle John was not the author. Furthermore, if you regard Papias having at least normal intelligence from the fact he was appointed bishop, then you have a pupil of John who in 100 AD directly links Revelation to John the Apostle. How Revelation ranks number one in confirmation. In fact, what is frequently overlooked is that the canonicity of Revelation is established on stronger evidence than any other book of the New Testament. No other book in the New Testament has a contemporaneous account from a third party, a bishop, church leader, etc., that an actual apostle wrote the work. You will never find an associate of Mark, Luke, or even Paul who leaves a memoir confirming any of them wrote the books that bear their name. It is simply historians referencing unnamed sources who tell us that these were the authors of these works. Matthew, however, was attested to by the Ebionite communities written by Matthew. Now, that was the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, not the Greek translation. So just to be clear. Yet the Ebionites are a controversial group, so I'm not weighing their claim at this point. Yet the author of Revelation as Apostle John is actually proven by a Christian bishop who was a friend of Apostle John. Please recall that expositions quoted above by Eusebius stated, quote, as to the inspiration of the book of Revelation, Papias bore entirely satisfactory testimony to it. If one claims that this is insufficient to prove authenticity, one would have to dismiss all the other books of the entire New Testament. They're even less confirming evidence of authenticity. As to every book other than Revelation and Matthew, we're all assuming that tradition provides an adequate foundation to know the author's identity. Only with Revelation do we have something better than tradition. We have a contemporaneous record that a friend of Apostle John confirms its authenticity. Accordingly, most experts now regard the authenticity of Revelation as beyond question. That's in John Walford's book, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, Moody Press, 1966 at 1415. Reformation doubts about the canonicity of Revelation. While Eusebius was motivated by politics to dispute Revelation, there were theological problems with Revelation for reformers like Luther. While Luther did not explain his hostility to Revelation, he rejected it as non-canonical. Luther, 1522, Preface to the New Testament, number 8. Now, I'm going to pause there. Luther was super pro-Paul. The book of Revelation is perceived by scholars who are objective, Bauer, and so on, Lightfoot, as anti-Paul and pro-Jesus. Why? Because it's obvious that Revelation's doctrines did not square with the teachings of Paul. Revelation emphasizes the law, Israel, Moses, Mount Zion, and the sons of Israel. Most important of all is Revelation's doctrine on grace and works. Revelation comes about 20 years after Paul is dead, maybe 10 years. Paul dies in about 60, so this is about 67 AD, so maybe 7 years. I wrote this 2 decades ago. Paul's writings on grace, 2 decades, I wrote this in 2005, so that's 17 years ago, 18 years ago. Paul's writings on grace are well known, yet Revelation purports to be Jesus talking to 7 churches, but never once mentioning grace as a doctrine in any positive way. Moreover, Jesus emphasizes in Revelation the crucial importance of works. Revelation's doctrines on their face are foreign to Pauline thinking. Luther must have realized Revelation fails to endorse any of Paul's doctrines. If it really were written by Apostle John and Apostle John inspired by Jesus' words, then why doesn't John/Jesus endorse Paul and his doctrines? Why instead would Apostle John and Jesus give grist for the opponents of Paul? Thus, Martin Luther in 1522 initially rejected Revelation as canonical. Apparently, for similar theological concerns, Calvinists in their first draft of the Westminster Confession of 1643 declared Revelation as non-canonical. Why I thought all Scripture is inspired of God, not if you're a Calvinist. Let's just take a look at some of this in a second. We'll go down there in a second. The Westminster Confession's final draft of 1647, however, 4 years later, restored Revelation fully into canon, WCF chapter 1, paragraph 2. But why did they do that? Let's take a look at some of these footnotes. Luther wrote in 1522 that he could find no trace of evidence that the book of Revelation was written by the Holy Spirit. In other words, he rejected its divine inspiration. Larry Crutchfield, Revelation in the New Testament, a Bible Handbook to Revelation. Luther modified his views some years later. However, to the end, Luther remained doubtful about the book's authenticity. So says that author. Larry Crutchfield says Revelation New Testament. So the authority about the Westminster Confession removing for 4 years the book of Revelation is referenced here. Larry Crutchfield, Revelation New Testament, a Bible Handbook to Revelation, Grand Rapids, Craigle, 2001 at 34 and 25. Quote, Article 3 of the Westminster Confession, composed in 1643, rejected it as canonical scripture. Crutchfield is professor of early Christian history at Columbia Evangelical Seminary, Longview, Washington. Let's continue. Luther and the Calvinists gave no grounds to reject Revelation. By the way, they're just summary conclusions, not any rationale for it. They denied its validity on conclusory statements. No details were provided. Thus, there was no hint of what was the basis for concern. We may never know for certain why Luther and Calvinists wanted Revelation ignored. However, the theology in Revelation is so obviously at odds with Paul that this must be the explanation. The fact Jesus is actually the revelator in Revelation and John is merely transcribing what he is seeing and hearing means Jesus is potentially correcting the record. Paul is long gone. His letters are well known. Jesus is potentially dealing with the issue of Paul. Thus, if authentic and anti-Pauline, the source of that message is Jesus and not merely an apostle. The variances between Paul and Jesus in the book of Matthew cannot be ascribed any longer to Paul having later been given a better insight from Jesus. Why? Because Paul's dead. Paul is dead when this is written. He's died well before 67 AD, 68 AD, and that's why. There's no way that Paul could be coming with a superseding message, because if this book is anti-Paul, Paul's already gone. So this is Jesus correcting the record. That's how you have to look at it. When the book of Revelation is written, Paul is dead. If Jesus is revealing new things to Apostle John, it is supplanting potentially the message of Paul. Therefore, the contradictions and variances between Jesus and Paul in the book of Revelation, if irreconcilable, potentially prove Paul was not a true apostle. Jesus expects us to obey his word and test Paul by it as well. That's what I wrote in 2005. It was part of Jesus' words only, and I had to cut it out to save room. But that's a chapter I cut out, but I think we need to hear it today, because I'm hearing a lot of people who don't understand the book of Revelation came way early. And I want to just go through the dating real quick. All right. And a recent scholar put together a very good paper on this, what you were never told about the book of Revelation. So let me read this to you. Dating the book of Revelation. One of the most important items in terms of interpreting the Bible is to understand the historical context in which it was written. Much of the debate concerning Bible prophecy hinges on when Revelation was written, while dispensational scholars, those are people who basically say Jesus' words are for a different earlier dispensation, and now Paul and his words and his revelations are all what you have to follow. While dispensational scholars insist that John wrote his apocalypse in the mid-90s, right? A more compelling argument can be made for a much earlier date, around 65, 66 AD. So this is important, this dating. Now, one may ask, why is this important? After all, it was nearly 2,000 years ago. What difference does 30 years make? Obviously, 30 years or even 10 years can make a big difference in the history of a nation. Germany and Japan in 1950 were quite a bit different than they were in 1940. In the same way, Rome and Jerusalem, and the two main players in the book of Revelation, were much different in 96 AD than they were in 66 AD. Thus, the dating of the book of Revelation becomes crucial in properly interpreting the book. So I'm going to read you this very quickly, and you'll get the gist of the. All right, and here under number 4, to the same point, in Quiz Salvus Dives, section 42, Clement of Alexander writes, quote, a true account of John the Apostle that has been handed down and preserved in memory, when after the death of the tyrant he removed from the island of Patmos of Ephesus. So only after the death of Nero did he leave the island of Patmos. So that's where his the message of Revelation came to him, on the island of Patmos. So after Nero dies in 68 AD, he leaves. The fact that Clement does not identify the tyrant suggests that it was probably Nero, not Domitian. Nero was universally feared and despised, and his name became the household word for anything evil. Internal evidence. 1. Revelation was written during the reign of the 6th Roman emperor. That would be Nero. Revelation 17:10, quote, there are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue for a short time. And here are some of the dates of the 6 emperors. The 7th king was Galba. 2. Revelation was written during a time of great persecution of the church, Revelation 2:10, and then he gives some of that. Revelation was written, this is the key, I think. Revelation was written while the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, before the Romans destroyed the holy city in 70 AD. He should have mentioned that, Revelation 11, 1-2. So how do we know it was standing? Quote, then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. All right, so all that evidence of an early date is overwhelming, but there's one argument for a late date, so let's see what that's about. Evidence for a late date. The only evidence for the 95 AD date is a vague statement made by Irenaeus, the 2nd century bishop of Lyons, in his book Against Heresies, who writes, we will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist, for if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our days, towards the end of Domitian's reign. So it doesn't tell us it's the book of Revelation, but that's how people read it. And then it says it's towards the end of the Domitian's reign. We'll take a look at what that may mean. Against heresies, book 5, chapter 30, verse 3. Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 AD. Irenaeus' statement is quite vague. He's not real clear on exactly what was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign. However, even if we allow for the understanding that John saw the vision during Domitian's reign, Irenaeus remains a questionable source at best. In the same book, he wrote that Jesus had an earthly ministry of 15 years and lived to be almost 50 years old. Yes, Irenaeus is not a reliable source. Anybody who thinks so, just remember those facts. And I could go through it all here, but I'm not going to do there. After the 14th and 15th year, it began to verge towards elder age, which our Lord was of when he taught, as the gospel and all the elders witnessed. Jesus had 15 years. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So earthly ministry of 15 years and lived almost to be 50. Just simply doesn't understand the history. So he's not a good historian at all. Okay. All right, but Irenaeus becomes problematical because he influences others to read history in this crazy way of looking at things, just as crazy as Jesus was 15 years around and lived to age 50. Okay, here's what he says. There are other church fathers such as Victorius and Eusebius who also hold to this late date. However, they clearly use Irenaeus as a source for their belief. Here is Eusebius. Irenaeus, in the 5th book of his work Against Heresies, where he discusses the number, the name of the Antichrist, which is given in the so-called Apocalypse of John, speaks as follows concerning him. And then it has the remarks we've seen. So that's how he concludes. He was wrote late in the 90s. In fact, Eusebius in his work Evangelicum Demonstratium contradicts this belief, placing John's banishment under Nero. So even Eusebius gets it right, ultimately. Conclusion. When the evidence is weighed, both internally and externally, it clearly supports the Neronic date. This fact is crucial considering that John was writing for the first century churches of Asia Minor regarding things which must shortly take place. Revelation 1:1, that they're near, Revelation 1:3, and we're about to take place, Revelation 1:19. All right, so there's one last piece of evidence. He talks about the Syriac Peshitta, okay? And this had discussion where it says in an inscription of the books in the Syrian version of the Peshitta Bible, the New Testament, first published by Deuteronomy Du in 1627 and afterwards in the London Polyglot, reads this way, quote, the revelation which was made by God to John the Evangelist in the island of Patmos, to which he was banished by Nero the Emperor. So that again puts what happened in the book of Revelation is all relating to the era of Nero, and Nero died in 68 AD. And so, gentle reader, if the author of Revelation was in Patmos, as it says in Revelation verse 1, during the reign of Nero, as this external evidence maintains, he must have written the Revelation before the death of Nero in 68 AD, of course, because then he's released. So I don't think there's any doubt about it, but of course, the dispensationalists, those who believe Jesus's words belong to a different dispensation, they don't like the book of Revelation because it's doesn't have the same gospel as Paul. It has the gospel of Jesus from the Gospels, and that's not tolerable. And this is after Paul's dead, and so it's not good. So they don't want it to be, they want to put it so late that you would think it's not valid. Maybe it was just fabricated. But if you take that position, you put your whole salvation at stake, because if you take one word, let alone the whole book out of the Bible, as the Calvinists tried in the Westminster Confession, and as Luther did in his initial opinion about the book of Revelation, because he could see through the pattern was very anti-Paul. Just admit it. Bauer saw it too. Everybody sees it if you take time to look at it. That's why they've tried to change the date, to get it late, and so you forget about it. And they try to, but how do they move the book of John up? I don't know. Papias is a bishop later in life. He's an adult around 100 AD. How does he get to be the amanuensis of the book of John about the same time as the book of Revelation is supposedly written? So that's just, and it doesn't make sense. John's a prisoner on Patmos in the 60s, and he talks about a temple that's still standing. So I think it's beyond doubt that if you didn't have dispensationalists creating confusion, and there was a mistaken Irenaeus who has absolutely no reliability factually. He says Jesus lived to 50, and he had a ministry of 15 years. Do you believe that? No. So he's not He's not a historian at all. He's terrible. Okay. Anyway, I hope that helps everyone. God bless. Take care. Ciao.